Hi, everyone. It's going to be a wonderful event.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're just going to give people a minute or two to join. We understand people are rushing around, meetings are ending late, people are either getting into lunch, finishing out their day, getting ready for the evening. So let's give everyone just a minute or two more. Alrighty, everybody. I'm going to get us started. People can roll in, can roll out. We'll have this recorded as well, and we'll put up on the WCAPS YouTube page. So as you would like, for your own knowledge, if you feel uncomfortable being on camera or anything like that, this is the right time to turn off your camera. Please be mindful as well, just moving forward, that this will be recorded and you can access later, but also, keep that in mind. So welcome to this inaugural event for the new Climate Change Working Group. So first of all, we are WCAPS, which is the Women of Color Advancing Peace, Security, and Conflict Transformation. Really, the idea here is that there are voices that need to be at the table that are disproportionately impacted whether it's across security, across conflict, and for us, across climate change. So we are the climate change working group within that. We've gone through some massive changes. Our leadership has shifted, and Lisa and I, who I'll introduce you to in a minute, have brought on a whole leadership team around us. You'll meet 2 of them today, but really there's 10 overall. And these are incredible women who span the globe, right across Africa, Asia, Europe, North America, Central America. They come from professions such as comms, humanitarian assistance, food aid, energy sector issues. And so what brings us to the table is a deep passion for making sure that those who don't have immediate access to power, but who are at the same time disproportionately impacted by these issues, have a seat at the table, have a seat as we're thinking about policy, whether that is little p or big P policy at the government level, at the climate summit level, et cetera. And so for us, this is a taste of really what our team looks like, how we want to think about the intersections of climate change with everything else, because as many of us like to think, climate change is really foundational to everything we think about, whether it's education, whether it's development, whether it's economics, and certainly when we think about gender, right? You don't know where one begins and one ends. And so without further ado, let me give you an introduction to our speakers. I'll give you a quick overview of what we mean when we talk about the intersections of climate change and why we don't view it as one kind of monolithic idea, but really something that has to be involved in everything else for us to be able to deal with the crises around us. My name is Dilafruz Khonikboyeva, as I mentioned. I'm the co-chair here at WCAPS, the Climate Change Working Group. Could we go to the next slide, please? Yeah, this is what I do. My focus really is on environmental justice and really the intersection of conflict, comms, and climate change. My co-chair is Lisa. Could we go to the next slide, please? And she's a researcher, a writer, and a consultant. She really specializes in conflict, climate change, and migration in Africa. So I'm really excited to hear case studies from her. After that, we'll hear from Ananya. And she's actually part of our new leadership team. So we're really glad to have her on side. She's already done so much for us already in leading. But she's our communications lead. She's a feminist researcher, activist, and comm specialist, really thinking at the intersection of gender, violence, peace, and security, and she's based in India. And then certainly last but not least, we have Renee, who is also part of our new communications leadership team. We're thrilled to have her. We're also thrilled to hear about her own research around diplomacy, climate, and environmental policy. She's currently based in France. So just as a quick framing, when we talk about climate change, we're not talking about just carbon and carbon sequestration, right? We're not just talking about the melting of the polar ice caps. We're talking about climate as it impacts each of us. So the nature around us, the way we think about the food we get, right? The way we talk about who's at the table and what impact looks like. And so the conversation we're having today is really why are we looking at specific groups differently, right? Why do we think this has an outsized impact on gender? Why do we think that this has an outsized impact on the global south? And I think as framing, I'll say that on Monday, the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate, released its final report. And this is really, really important because as countries go to places like COP, the climate summit, and make these big commitments and decisions, they're really looking to this research. And for the first time in its history since 1990s, when it started these reports, it mentioned colonialism as both a historical and ongoing driver of climate crisis. And so one, I think that framing is really important for a writing in a group that tends to be very restricted, very conservative, and really tries to take a scientific and not a social science approach. So I think the conversation we're having now is not at the fringe of climate change. It's certainly front and center. It is not only understanding how we've gotten where we are and why, global south is seeing the impacts of this far more, but also understanding how we get to a solution that's not just government signing papers, but how do we integrate climate crisis and climate mitigation and adaptation into everything we do. One more statistic I'll give, and then I'll actually hand over to Lisa, is that, for example, Indigenous peoples are less than 5% of the population, but they protect 80% of biodiversity. So to me, the question that arises is then, if this group has historically been very, very good at maintaining these natural habitats and this biodiversity that is critical, right, for the rest of us to live and breathe and have effective ecosystems, then how do we, moving forward, continue to support them, one, protect them from violence, which is a real issue, two, because at the end of the day, that impacts all of us, right? I think that's the bottom line here, is by dealing with the people who are most impacted by colonialism and the legacy of colonialism, which is Global South, people of color, Black people, Indigenous people, women, right? We then make the world better and safer, and that safety and that betterment impacts everybody across the board. So I'll stop there. I'm going to hand over to Lisa to do a little bit more with this framing and give us examples from Africa. I will say, please use the chat function. We want to take your questions. We want to take your comments. And so please put them in the chat and I'll make sure that we address them. All right. Lisa, over to you.
Thanks so much, Dilafruz. Can everyone hear me okay? I'll take that as yes. Okay, great. So yeah, and thanks everyone for being here. We're so excited to launch this event. I'll get straight into it. So yeah, women and girls are disproportionately affected by climate change. This is especially true in developing and conflict settings. I'll let my other colleagues talk a little bit more about the interaction of climate change and conflict specifically. But I think it's worth saying real quick that women and girls are disproportionately affected by conflict in and of itself. So they're especially vulnerable to sexual and domestic violence in conflict settings. Sexual violence is used as a weapon of war, of course. Women in refugee and resettlement camps face higher threats of sexual and gender-based violence. But women also suffer disproportionately from the effects of climate change. And this is especially true in Africa and other developing countries because those are the areas hit hardest by climate change. And this is because for women specifically, why they're more vulnerable, they lack representation in existing power structures, right? They rarely have enough seats at the table when discussing climate change adaptation and mitigation strategies. And related to that, when you have more patriarchal societies, men tend to be more or better equipped at adaptive or having better adaptive capacities, right? They have more job flexibility, better education, a greater ability to migrate if necessary. And women also lack basic access to basic human rights, and land rights is an important one when thinking about climate change. Women also tend to be more poor. There's a high tendency for them to live in poverty, and this alone compounds other vulnerabilities. And women in African developing countries especially may be dependent on rain-fed agriculture, and that is extremely sensitive to change in weather patterns, right? If the rainy season comes a month later, it could throw off the crops for the whole year. This has drastic consequences. Women also tend to be involved in informal work and have just fewer economic opportunities to turn to if the rainy season comes late and they aren't able to produce the crops they normally depend on. Women in developing countries tend to also have lower access to credit and markets, which means they have a reduced ability to save up money and invest in new technologies that might help adaptation. So as Dilafruz said, I'm going to give some examples from Africa. That's what my research background is in. So one example of how women are disproportionately affected by climate change, the effects of climate change, is the cyclone that hit Mozambique, Malawi, and Zimbabwe a couple of years ago in 2019. This was a horrible natural disaster. As I'm sure you all know, it displaced around 2 million people. And an example of how women and girls suffered disproportionately from that is within refugee camps, within the disaster camps, women and girls tended to take on more responsibilities, and they still do. This could mean standing in long lines for aid. This could mean walking long distances to fetch water. And they also face higher risks of abuse in these camps. So in all these ways, they're more vulnerable. Another quick example In northwestern Nigeria, Boko Haram has been known to target women who have been displaced by drought or other natural disasters. And research from Malawi suggests that climate change has increased the likelihood of girls being married young, just out of economic necessity. So these are all just examples of different ways that climate change does affect women and girls disproportionately. And that's all I'll say on that for now, and I'll pass it on to our next speaker.
Thank you, Lisa. And when starting to talk about the gendered impact of climate change, I'll just dive a little bit deeper into the aspect that women are poorer than men because they have restricted access to resources in terms of inheritance, land, and things like that. They earn a lower wage for doing basically the same job, and even they are disproportionately highly represented in the reproductive economy of the household sphere, which is highly unpaid and is not even considered work because it's unpaid. And they are traditionally also more dependent on natural resources for survival. Inequalities within the societal and household structures also ensure that the brunt of climate change impacts like limited food availability, depletion of household resources fall more on women. The multiple social, political, economic hurdles that women face in accessing their rights and resources also hinders their ability to cope with these adversities which are put forth by climate change. Women face structural and systematic violence, especially women who have multiple marginal social identities in terms of class, caste, race, sexuality, etc. And the violence is only intensified during times of crisis which are brought by climate change. And this essentially means that as climate change intensifies, women are going to struggle the most. And I'm going to explain this through some examples which are based in South Asia, because that's where I'm from and that's where I work. In South Asia, women have disproportionate reproductive and caregiving responsibilities. There's a gross imbalance of work between men and women. Especially in agrarian communities, women help both in farming activities, raising livestock, as well as they undertake all household responsibilities, child nurturing, and caring for the household members. One example is in Indonesian rural society, women are usually allocated the task of collecting water for drinking, cooking, washing, and other things. So as droughts intensify and water resources continue to dry up, it means women now have to travel longer distances to collect water. In the photo, you see Indonesian villager swimming upstream with about 200 empty jerry cans tied to her back, a daily trip that she and other local women make to get clean water for their community. In the scorching heat, these women make the 4-kilometer journey in 1 hour through the murky Mandar River to clean water wells which are built along the riverbank. These women get paid about 500 rupiah, which essentially converts to 3.5 US cents for each can. So $7 for the whole load, which is vital for the sustenance of 5,800 families in the Tinambang district. If you can change the slide, please. When we look at India, we see a very similar phenomena taking place. This happens in a state called Maharashtra, which is located at the southwestern part of the Indian peninsula, which has traditionally experienced droughts and long dry spells. We see this phenomena taking place, which is called the water wives. In this particular village of Thenmangal, there are no taps and water is only available at 2 wells, which are located at the bottom of a rocky hill. The severe drought has faced in this region has further intensified with climate change, and it has led to worsening of water problems. Women have the responsibility to fetch water, but carrying enough water often messes up with their health. They are often pregnant, they have to take care of their children, and as a result, it hinders their ability to carry these really, really heavy jars full of water. And to solve this problem, because we need to remember that people in this village are really poor, men mainly work as farm laborers and they earn a minimum wage. To solve this issue, what happened is that men started marrying for water. And this essentially means that men started taking more than one wife, so more women could fetch water and sustain the family. And this has become the only option for this economy. But one of the really interesting things to note about this situation is that some women living in this village who were kind of isolated by their families, they were left alone, and widowed women who had nobody to take care of them. They said that this situation of this polygamy, which is otherwise not allowed in India, happening in this village, has helped them become a part of a family and leading a better life, because otherwise they were just left alone by their families and had absolutely nothing. So although polygamy is a super oppressive thing, it's important to note how these interesting changes are taking place in women's lives as a response to climate change. If you can change the slide. Food scarcity is another most well-known aspect of climate change. As rainfall becomes irregular, extreme weather conditions like cyclones, droughts, flash floods increase, crops get ruined and harvest suffers. Food shortage takes place in families, and it impacts women the worst. Because traditionally men's health, their appetite, their productive capacities are valued more than that of women. So most of the food, or the most nutritious food that's available in the family, is always given to the male members, and the least nutritious food or the least amount of food is given to women. So as food becomes scarce, it's going to impact women the worst, and they are going to suffer from malnutrition. And also diseases have become really common in times of climate disasters, which puts an unequal burden of care labor on women. And we will discuss that shortly. During times of climate disasters like storms, floods, droughts, where families suffer economically, the first assets that the household sells to keep itself afloat are small assets like animals, gold jewelry, or small land holdings. And these small assets are mostly owned by women. And even when the moment of crisis passes, these assets are not recovered for women. They don't buy back the jewelry that the woman had to sell off during the time of crisis, or buy back the livestock. So as a result, women's position within the family becomes more vulnerable. You'll notice that this was the exact case that took place during the pandemic. An increasing of this vulnerability of women within the household and decision-making capacities, suspension of social services like women's shelters, NGOs, strict lockdowns that cut off women from their family members, support structures, also led to an increase in domestic violence across the world. If you can change to the next slide. As you see in this image, so it's a woman with an oxygen concentrator who's cooking near an oven, a fire stove, and it went viral in India. There was a guy who shared this photo of his mother, and he said, "Unconditional love, a mother, she's never off duty." So looking apart from the fact that this is an extremely hazardous and dangerous scenario where the oxygen concentrator can easily catch on fire, it's a woman who's so sick with COVID who has to cook for her family as her son clicks a photo and glorifies motherhood. So the pandemic also worsened the care economy. Women were already working double time at homes with all the family members staying at home. External services, like you would order food when you didn't want to cook. You would send your laundry to laundry services. You had a domestic help to help you with household chores. Those were all options were not there when the pandemic situation happened. And incomes were also reduced because most family members did not get paid. The option to work from home wasn't given to everybody. So you had these middle class families who were sustaining with the reduced income because of the labor of women, because they were now doing the work of the domestic help, they were now doing the work of the food facilities, of launderers, and they were not charging any money. And this put great pressure on women. And with COVID, what also happened was medical infrastructures and medical resources were diverted on COVID care. And because incomes were also low, people with COVID and non-COVID diseases also hesitated to seek medical help. And as a result, you had women nursing these sick family members to health, which put their lives also at risk. So women who were tested positive for COVID, or people who had those symptoms, also hesitated to being tested or isolated, because who would cook for the family? Who would take care of the family members? And this photo is just one of the huge examples how this sort of really oppressive situation was glorified as mother's love. If you can change to the next slide. And the last example I just want to give is this impact of a cyclone called Amphan, which hit where I live, Kolkata and West Bengal and Orissa, which is located kind of in the northeastern coastal side of India. And the COVID pandemic, the lockdown started in India in the last week of March, and this cyclone hit India in May. So this was already 2 months where people were without any income. People were already struggling with the disease and the stress. And it was the worst cyclone we had in decades, and the worst that I had obviously seen. If you can change to the next slide. And these images are just to show an extent to which the damage happened. People lost their homes, their harvest, houses were crushed up, and there was literally nothing to rely on. And as a result, a few months later, cases of human trafficking and child marriages increased in regions which were worst impacted by this cyclone. And what happened was that families were marrying off their daughters, and there were also these traffickers who were disguising themselves as employers, online running schemes, promising women to give them jobs in cities, were trafficking them. And because families always view women as liabilities, where they wouldn't necessarily give a son away because he embodies that labor that he can get his family out of poverty, but a woman is a liability, these situations increased. And because of climate change, we've been having a lot more of these cyclones. Where I live in Kolkata, we used to have one major cyclone, tropical cyclone in a year. And last year we had one cyclone every other month. And as these situations are going to worsen, it's worth thinking, how vulnerable are women going to be? How many more women are going to be sold off or married off? And where is their future lying in all of this? The Sundarbans and the Delta, which is the largest in the world, has been one of the natural resources which has really protected this part of West Bengal from bad cyclones, because the mangrove forest cuts the velocity of the wind of the tropical cyclones created in the Bay of Bengal. But that forest has been degrading, and the mangrove trees have been cut off, they've been damaged, and there's no real responsibility that the governments or anybody else is taking in restoring them. So as these situations worsen, it's worth thinking what's going to happen to the girls and what's going to happen to women. And obviously these are women from rural communities, women who are from lower castes like Dalits, from lower classes, who are suffering the worst. And with this, I'll just turn on to the next speaker, who's going to talk about militarism and climate change.
Thank you, Ananya. Yeah, so that was a fantastic, I think those framing questions at the end are exactly what we hope everyone will be thinking about now, is when many people live in cultures and societies that already, where women are vulnerable, how does climate change, how does COVID, how do all these things compound vulnerability is the phrase you used, and I really love that. I think I'm really excited to hear Renee speak, right? Because we know from conflict that conflict increases vulnerability. Conflict increases already problems in society. And then on top of that, we have this issue where climate change causes conflict and conflict causes climate change, right? And so Renee, maybe I'll turn to you. We're really excited to hear from you specifically about militarism and climate change. So how does armed conflict and militarism contribute to climate change? And what does this mean specifically for women, if you will?
Thank you, Dilafruz. So basically, just to lay the foundation, we have to remind ourselves and to also educate other people in understanding that military must be considered the key driver of ecological degradation. And we have to reassess how excessive the extraction of resources has been to fulfill different militaristic or conflict needs. Because right now we're using a lot of things to act, we're using a lot of resources as if they're unlimited renewable resources. But the use of military responses as a primary strategy for conflict resolution and even for securing control over, resource-rich areas has been closely linked to environmental degradation and the increase of greenhouse gas emissions. And to just kind of put everything into perspective, in 3 weeks of combat in Iraq, the US Army burned 40 million gallons of fuel. which is about 2 million gallons per day, which is equivalent to the combined gas consumption of all the Allied army forces during the 4 years of World War I. So you can see how exponential we have grown in our use of non-renewable resources. And specifically, most of our societies are largely structured for war and not peace. And global investments for militarism and then their subsequent wars totals about $2 trillion US annually. And arms and other military equipment needed for war can be directly sourced to the excessive resource extraction, which is needed to continue these militaristic endeavors. And so they're seen as an essential and needed service. So militaries consume, vast quantities of fossil fuels that contribute to carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. They produce large quantities of toxic wastes that present environmental concerns at every stage of every person's life cycle, and it's a consistent cycle. They often establish an unequal use of natural resources when they create those greenhouse gas emissions, and they cause climate instability, and then that leads to more wars as well. So greenhouse gas emissions have increased like tenfold, even 40-fold even, and the US military spending has also increased as the greenhouse gas emissions have increased. In 2021, the US spent over $700 billion just on the defense budget alone. So we really have to hold the military accountable and recognize that climate change through militarization both promotes and echoes current societal gender divides, and it continues to highlight women's vulnerabilities. And specifically, when we look at how women are affected, like was stated before, they're not able to hold proportionate amounts of power as men. And so in reality, we can't really hold women fully responsible for conflicts and for greenhouse gas emissions, even though they're the first to feel the impacts either through physical and sexual violence or through displacement from war or from climate change events. And even after these events occur, the psychological effects still have a huge impact on women, and then it trickles down into the community in ways that we're not even sure of today. So the effects of war and climate change tear apart the fabric of communities and families by destroying the rights and the lives of women on a daily basis. We know that women are more likely to be impacted because they make up 70% of poor people worldwide. And just like with the military cycle, women and girls are less likely to have material resources and educational backgrounds to adapt to or alleviate the effects caused by these events. And it's only going to get worse, especially as these events increase in frequency. We know that climate change endangers livelihoods and the safeties of people. We're losing access to food and water, and essential services are threatened. And it's even worse when you have communities that have already really strived to achieve certain developmental milestones. When these devastating actions occur, they're set back even further from where they started. And so these issues can compound on problems that were already experienced within these different communities, and they prolong instability and conflict within, weakened institutions and systems, and just however people are able to cope in general. We can attribute about 3 to 20% of armed conflicts over the last century due to climate and environmental factors. And so again, this is only expected to increase as time goes on. So for women, when they experience these events, they're probably going to experience social exclusion, economic risks, further environmental degradation, and then even tensions over those resources. 37% of agriculture was contributed to the conflicts in affected countries. And that's 2 to 4 times higher than in developing countries, which are not affected by conflict or fragility. So women might be more compelled to, oh no, what's going on? My computer is freaking out.
We can still hear you, Renee.
Okay, my computer is flashing and I don't know why. This is so weird. Hold on. Okay, it's done. I'm so sorry. Okay. So I don't remember what I was saying. Oh, women are going to be more compelled to migrate, or they're already migrating from their homes, going into urban regions in search of work and sustenance. And these areas might be already overcrowded and poor. So that makes them even more disaster prone to climate events, but that also leads to more violence and conflict as well. And then those that aren't able to move or adapt are continuously still subjected to violence and rapid onset humanitarian disaster. The problem with all of this is that we really don't have a straightforward path in how we study conflict and its relation to climate change. There's a lot of arguments about if it actually has a significant contribution to conflict or if it's just a symptom with a negligible impact. But we know that it is an important thing that we need to study and focus on because climate has a threat multiplier effect on societies. And so I skipped it, but if you can go to 2 slides from now, looking at it through a feminist lens, I think it's really important for us to look at climate change and war through a feminist lens. And this is not where I'm going to bash men or say that they're the evil of the world, but I do want us to take a look to have an idea of looking at it through a masculine or a feminist lens, because climate breakdown and war are structural and they originate in a patriarchal, racist economic system of extractive capitalism. And there is a huge emphasis placed on the global economy that allows economic growth to take center stage in exchange for environmental degradation. And so humans and man believe that they have a direct right to have dominion over nature and that they deserve access to inexpensive and abundant, which you could read as feminized, non-renewable resources that provide energy for powerful military weaponry. And these weapons are necessary to, again, exert masculine ideas of protection of our community or just to even showcase our global superiority. So, you know, climate change is human produced, and so are socially constructed gender roles, and masculinity is limited not only those socially constructed problems, but it ensures that the ways that we fight against climate change and environmental degradation are also very masculinized as well. So it's really important that we don't see women 100% as victims or as spoils of war or things like that, but we also don't see women as fully as the saviors of sustainability, but they do need to have a seat at the table. And it's very important for these voices to be heard in situations in conflict, especially when we're looking at environmental degradation. So I'll pass it off to the next person.
Thank you, Renee. That was really, really helpful. We're going to end with Lisa, but I did want to present a framing that I think I find really helpful from a conflict resolution lens. So when we think about violence in the conflict resolution world, we turn to Galtung, who presents violence as a triangle. It's almost like an iceberg. The tip of the iceberg above the water is what you see. So it's the actual violence. It's the disproportionate impact of, forced migration on women. It's gender-based violence. It is issues such as seeking dowry for women in much of the world, right? Or for women to pay dowry in much of the world. And so that's the physical violence that we see, right? What is enacted upon women. But underneath is the bigger portion of the triangle under the water, right? And so those are cultural, social, economic violence. And so it's things like the assumption that, Ananya touched on this culturally, is thinking that women are a burden or a liability on a family and on a community. And so they have to be managed. It's a risk management issue, right? Things like if women act outside of a very prescribed way, then they almost quote unquote allow violence to happen to them, right? Or the idea that women have to be caretakers. And so that means that their health, their priorities are not on the line. And so I present this framing to kind of double down on what Renee is saying, which is that the idea here is by addressing these issues, not just the physical violence, but yes, these cultural expectations and political expectations, et cetera, around this. So Kennedy has a great question for later, but I'm actually going to turn to Lisa to get us into some of these climate actions. So Lisa, could you walk us through some gender responsive climate actions that can be taken to promote better security for women and girls who we know now are much more vulnerable to changes in the environment? And then everybody, I see some questions coming in specifically to me, so I'm really excited to have our panelists answer that after Lisa speaks. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, Dilafruz, you gave this great explanation of what climate justice is at the beginning. And I think it's worth reiterating that just a bit real quick. So climate justice involves this shifting of a discourse, right? The discourse on climate change away from a sole focus on environmental factors, ice caps and emissions, right? Towards a focus on a discussion of people and communities most vulnerable to the effects of climate change. And women, of course, as we've seen today, are one of these groups most vulnerable. And it involves really reframing the climate discourse towards one that incorporates a civil rights component to the discussion. And so this is building off what Renee said. Certainly, I think it's a very important point, are to consider colonial legacies, which are so embedded in existing power structures. And part of the reason why women don't, and especially Indigenous women, don't have enough seats at the table when talking about climate solutions. The world, and especially the West, has this long history of colonial domination of the global South. And that, as Renee said again, is intrinsically linked to resource extraction. And so climate justice is about tackling both the economic, the power, and the ecological repercussions that stem from that history. And I'll leave this as a question. So if we take all that into account, what does it mean for the people who are currently benefiting from this long history? What do they owe to the people currently impacted by all these negative effects of this long history of colonial domination? And I'll leave it as a question. I think the short answer is a lot, but yeah. And a topic for another day. And climate justice, again, as we've heard today, also certainly necessitates a discussion of gender equality. And so how do we achieve this? How do we start working towards achieving climate justice, and especially one that incorporates gender equality? I think one of the most important things, one of the most important ways we'll achieve this climate justice is to just listen to women, listen to Indigenous women. And if you do research like I do, listen to especially rural African women, and especially elder rural African women. They have a huge wealth of knowledge, and they already have so many solutions to climate disruptions. And so it involves building on local knowledge that, and building on these types of solutions and adaptation and mitigation strategies that are already building use, and supporting those, and making sure that they are able to expand and thrive. As we're saying that rural African women in particular have been some of the first to notice the effects of climate change. Again, they're so in tune to the nuanced shifts of climate and climate changes. You know, they're the first to notice changing weather patterns, changes to agricultural productivity, disruptions to food and livestock security. So, you know, they have all this information, and it's so important to just listen to them. And if we're going to develop proactive interventions that do prioritize gender equality within climate justice, it really requires tackling both ends. So supporting adaptive capacity as well as reducing vulnerability. And so some actionable first steps we can take to achieve climate justice that incorporates gender equality are first ensuring that women have equal access to things like finance and credit, land and land rights, water and energy, and all these things. It also means supporting the development of women's skills and improving their access to technologies that will help them adapt to climate changes. And as I've said many times already, but elevating their voices, making sure there are seats at the table. If that doesn't happen, then going to them directly, right? And forgetting the table altogether. And I wanted to just end on sort of a high note and list some success stories. So first of all, we have research from Malawi's Lake Chilwa Basin, there are groups of rural women who have already been establishing networks for knowledge sharing. And this involves sharing knowledge about farming technologies, about what crops to plant during droughts. They've developed irrigation schemes, and they've really thrived from these networks that they've established. I also wanted to mention Elizabeth Watuthi. I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly. Many of you probably know her. She's a very young Kenyan environmentalist and climate activist. She spoke at COP last year. She founded the Green Generation Initiative. It's a youth-led organization focused on empowering and educating young people and helping communities develop sustainable solutions to the climate crisis. They've planted well over 30,000 trees, which is amazing. They're engaging with schools across the continent. So I just wanted to highlight that as a success story. And one other organization I wanted to highlight just as a success story is the IPACC. So that's the Indigenous Peoples of Africa Coordinating Committee. And this is a network of well over 100 Indigenous groups across 20 African countries that get together to support many groups, but pastoralist communities across Africa who are suffering terribly from climate change, droughts especially, right? They have to change their migration patterns so that they can have food and water for their livestock. And this group also, the IPACC, focuses on women and children, especially within the Indigenous communities. So I just wanted to highlight those and end on some success stories and as examples of how these actionable steps I mentioned earlier can really produce tangible results. And that's my end point, and I'll pass it back to Dilafruz, or our moderator who are taking questions. Thanks, everyone.
Lisa, that was fantastic. The quote I really like for that is forgetting the table altogether. I think that I would say is one of the many overarching themes here, is that in a world that has been built in very specific ways on colonial legacy, right? On maybe a male-oriented, really militaristic-oriented world. How do we go to sources of traditional knowledge, right? And how do we not try to translate those into the systems of power and structure that already exist, but how do we open that up and meet people where they are to say, we don't need you to build out the international economy, right? We need you to tell us what this means in your life and in your community.
I think we lost you, Dilafruz.
Apologies. I was going to say, Gabrielle had a really great question. So I was going to see if she'll come on the mic and ask it. And if she doesn't want to do that, I can ask for her, but it's for Ananya.
Hey, thanks for allowing me the space to ask the question. I just thought the portion about the water wives was fascinating, and I was curious to know if, it was kind of spun as a climate change benefit, and I wondered if anybody kind of took it the other way and spun it into kind of hoarding water. Yeah, and if that had any impact on the community as a whole. That was really it.
Can you hear me? By the way, I had to reconnect my earphones. Yeah.
Yep, I can hear you.
Okay. So although there has been no research done to understand the impact of the water wives system on the lives of villagers, how I see it as it's also a kind of acquiring labor, so means of production. So which are the men in the village who are able to get married and have 3-4 wives? These are men who are a little better off, who can feed these women, right? Because taking a wife just doesn't mean you're getting labor. You have to be responsible for this person's fooding, clothing, and shelter, which is also a lot. So what I see happening is these structures and lines of inequality really getting intensified, because men who are able to get married and get 3-4 women to get water from them will have more water than men who are poorer, who might not be able to take another wife, who might not be able to get that much water. So although I don't have ground data and there's been no ground research yet, but I do believe that these are the lines of inequality, which is again getting like reinstated in these situations, because I essentially see the water wives situation as a very capitalistic idea of hoarding labor and means of production, because you can afford it, and now you're going to get more water, you're going to have better crops because you're getting excess water, and people who are from poorer families, men who can't take more wives, will just be the ones who are suffering more.
That's fascinating. I really hope to hear more about that. I'm gonna go to Renee for the next question. I mean, I think one of these stats that you gave, right, is it 3% to 20% of armed conflict risk over the last century is climate influenced, right? And so I wanted to see if you wanted to give us a specific example of something we're seeing right now, a conflict that's happening, or anything you want to highlight as a specific example of this, and you know, the larger ramifications for a region or for migration or anything like that.
I think the one that comes to my mind first is specifically women that are fighting for in the Amazon, the indigenous women that are there. They are really pushing back against the government to protect the trees and to protect the water, because there's a lot of corporations that are down there tearing the trees down and dumping their pollution into the water. And there's been, you know, a lot of arrests, and I'm not 100% sure in terms of if it's gotten to like, you know, a grave, like armed full-on war or anything like that. But I do know that that is a significant issue where they're trying to push these people out and force them to migrate, and they're not able to do that, or they're not willing to do that because it is their land. But that would be one of the major ones that I would keep my eye on or become educated on, and if it's something that you are interested in. Because these are mostly the corporations that we interact with every day, like Nestle and things like that. So.
Thank you. I think the next one will probably go to Lisa. Kennedy, this was your question. So do you want to come off mute and ask this? Otherwise, I'm happy to ask for you.
Hi. Yes, thank you so much. So my question was, is it a cultural expectation that only women who journey for clean water, and why isn't it common for men to journey for clean water, since they are often physically more capable in the instances that were given to us?
So I actually asked this exact same question when I was doing some work in DR Congo recently. Because from my natural instinct is to say, well, if men are traditionally physically stronger, why aren't they doing this heavy lifting? And the answer I got is it's just tradition. It's just cultural, traditional. You know, women have, there are gendered responsibilities, kind of like anywhere in any culture. And whether it's child rearing or cooking or whatever, carrying water, collecting water is just traditionally a woman's job. And I think that's why it's so hard to make that switch. It's just so embedded in the culture. I don't know if my other colleagues have more insight on that, but that was the answer I got when I asked this question.
Yeah, so even in South Asian, specifically India, it's a really, really feminized activity. You have like a lot of romanticization of this water situation as well, because you see in the really arid part of Rajasthan, you have movies and shows which show women in colorful saris carrying like 3 huge like vessels of water on their heads against the desert, and it's shown as such a spectacular thing. Women meeting, talking to each other on wells, which also become parts of a space where women are conversing, sharing experiences. And in terms of what I've known in my experience is that while it's very much a cultural thing, it's also this idea that men are supposed to do the labor that earns the money. So whichever is a very monetized and economic perspective, that's what men are doing. And it's in a lot of areas of work that we consider to be masculine, but it's actually women are behind it. For example, a lot of farmers are just sowing the seeds for the harvest, and they move off to cities to do sort of paid labor for the rest of the year. And it's women who are tending to these crops, and they are the ones who we don't even, it doesn't even come to our mind when you think of the image of a farmer. And another reason I often find is that water is mostly used for washing dishes, cooking food, and like feeding to children and keeping at home. And these are also tasks that women are traditionally going to do. So a man is not going to inquire, how much water did you use today? Is this much water enough to wash all the clothes or wash all the dishes? So I think that's also one of the ways in how it's connected to that it's a woman's job, because it's kind of backbone to running the household, and the household is run by the woman, so that's what she is supposed to do. But the backline is always that because it's a non-monetized labor, in the whole day women have to go twice, thrice to bring enough water, and there are men out there who are there to earn money, and they come home tired, so they are not going to do any of these tasks, which is like so feminized.
That's fascinating. Thank you. One of the things that I think about quite a bit is I'm indigenous Pamiri from Central Asia. And so Pamiris are in Afghanistan, Tajikistan, Pakistan, West China. And for us, these issues of like climate change have been going on for many decades, right? Like you said, because when people are so tied to the land, they know when the water is not coming down at the right time to make sure this crop is growing. They know when there's issues around, soil preservation. They know when the shifting in like the clouds impacts how much sun the crops are getting. But I think even more is that to be Pamiri is fully defined by the land. Like we call ourselves that because the mountains are Pamiri. Our whole identity, how we view religion and culture and our language and even the words we use to describe self and identity is tied to the land. And so it's one of the things I think about as migration and water security and even physical security, especially with Pamiris who are in Afghanistan, for example. Physical security forces migration and forces, leaving behind these cultures and these identities and these traditional ways of life that we don't really want to, right? And so I wonder if any of you have examples or could speak to that a little bit, is when climate change is not forcing changes in a way of life, but as well identities and how people actually identify themselves and think about themselves. So I would love to hear more from any of you, our panelists, who can speak to that.
I think one thing I'm really focusing on is the fact, like specifically in parts of Africa, where there's a divide between, the shepherds and then everyone else. I can't remember the specific region, but the shepherds are really focused on maintaining their flock and making sure that they're taken care of. And that's kind of in conflict with the water resources that are available just for the rest of the people that live there. And so it's an us versus them kind of thing where, if they had come together as a community, they probably would be able to thrive a bit better. But instead, there's a lot of conflict in that area. And I don't know if Lisa has better examples, but that seems to be kind of like on the individual level where a lot of that stuff kind of happens.
Yeah, I'll just say, just to give some specific examples of that, that's absolutely right. You see that in like eastern Nigeria, right, where there's the pastoralists are coming into conflict with the farmers because they have to change their migration patterns. And no one wins in that situation, right? The farmers should be allowed to stay where they are, but also the pastoralists need to feed their livestock and earn a living. So it really brings to head this, that something needs to change. And you see similar things in Ethiopia and other countries. Yeah, just wanted to completely reiterate what Renee said. Thanks.
I just want to add one point on that, that it's also fascinating how what is seen, like how social hierarchies work in the way that what we view as contributing to climate change and pollution and what we don't. Like we had this whole conversation in the Indian Parliament where the person said that the farmers were like burning, slashing some of their dry hay and crops and things like that on the outskirts of the city was responsible for all the air pollution that was taking place, and not the heavy industries, not the cars that were running. And those changes don't need to happen, but it's the farmers who need to be stopped, and they are the ones who need to be seen as the villain, because it's so easy. They're uneducated, they don't know anything about climate, they're burning these like haze and all, and that's responsible for causing all the smog and everything, and not the heavy industries, the billion-dollar things that's polluting all the water. So really interesting how when we think of climate change, I remember reading this in my school book, we would think about slash and burn agriculture, but we would not always think about the heavy industries, the kind of fast fashion and things like that, how that's impacting climate change.
Yeah, sorry to just jump in. I'm seeing Abioli added this great point. The issue of migration due to climate change, right? Some people call them eco-refugees, however you want to classify them. Yeah, and so it's a new kind of migration. It's not seeking employment necessarily, or it's not you seeking different kinds of education. It's really it's a type of forced migration based on climate change. And I think I don't have an answer, but I think it's a really important question just to say out loud, how is this shifting identities? How are, if you want to call them eco-refugees, how are they adapting to the new environment? How are recipient or host countries accepting, or host regions accepting these eco-refugees? And yeah, it probably is. We are in a shifting transitional period where again, I don't know the answer, but it'll be interesting to see how this does affect identities.
What a perfect way to end. If you feel that you don't know where climate change begins and where other issues end, we've done our job. If you feel like there are more questions than there are answers, we've done our job. If you feel like you don't have all the solutions, again, we've done our job. The reality is this intersection is different for everybody. The solutions do not come from the top. Everybody has their own community-based solutions. And so we hope that what this does is give you a little taste of what we hope to be exploring in the Climate Change Working Group. We're really thankful for your time. Thank you, Ananya, Lisa, Renee. Thank you to the team for putting this together. We hope to have policy position papers coming. We hope to have other events. We hope to have discussions, and we're going to bring in kind of some high-level people and hopefully grill them about about their policies. But in general, we're grateful for your time, and we hope you really will kind of plug in with us. So thank you again. Take care.
Thanks so much, everyone.